The Institute.
Institute for Justice.
The National Law Firm for Liberty.
Welcome to Deep Dive with the Institute for Justice. I'm Melanie Hildreth, and I'm here today with IJ attorneys Rob Piccola and Keith Neely. Rob and Keith are litigating a cutting-edge property rights case in Memphis that has at its heart a so-called court that is run utterly without due process. Rob, when IJ launched this case, we released a video that was entitled, "Court Strips Elderly Woman of Her Home and Ruins Her Life." Now, that's a pretty dramatic title, and I wondered if you could start by explaining why it's not an exaggeration. Who is this woman and what happened to her?
Well, thank you, Melanie. When Ms. Holmberg's family and friends reached out to IJ and said that she was at risk of losing her home and had a warrant out for her arrest because of the condition of her home after a natural disaster, it seemed unbelievable to us. It didn't seem like something, frankly, that could happen in America. And the more that we learned about her situation and about the court where this was happening, the more unbelievable and yet sadly real it became. Ms. Holmberg is a decades-long resident of a very nice home that she owned outright with no mortgage. Tragedy struck. Natural disaster, as is common in Memphis, unfortunately, with their particular weather systems, had a tree fall on the home. And when the repair process began, and we all know how that can be, dealing with the insurance company, trying to get family to help, it's a huge undertaking. Suddenly, she found herself in something called an environmental court, something that we had never heard of, and that really, in the very name itself, is not very revealing about what the court actually is. What we learned is that this is a sort of quasi-social services agency where the people working there are not there to help you, but are actually in an adversarial role. When people go into this courtroom, and we actually ended up not only going down to view many proceedings ourselves, but also hired a courtroom monitor to watch what happened there was shocking. Rather than a court where people are taking evidence under oath, where there is a sense of record keeping, where you have an actual record of what happened in the case so that you can appeal, this was basically a free-for-all. People were bellowing out testimony from the audience. People were sitting up, shockingly, on the chair where the judge sat and donning robes whose identity was not really clear, and were still making decisions. One of the most peculiar things about this court is that rather than official court staff guiding people through the process, interns from law schools come out and sort of usher people in, explain to property owners that they're there to help reach a sort of deal regarding their home, but they don't tell them that they're acting as mini prosecutors. They are not there in a role to help the person actually see the process through. They're there in an antagonistic role. And I use the word social servants agency, but Melanie, imagine your very worst day at the DMV. And imagine if the outcome of that DMV proceeding was that you could be thrown in jail at the end of the day, or that you could lose your home. Well, for Ms. Holmberg, that is literally what happened. There was a warrant issued for her arrest, and she lost her home, had her possessions thrown in the street. You brought up how unbelievable this is, and we could hardly believe it until we saw it with our own eyes.
And this was a 10-year process where she attempted to make things right by going through the process with her insurance and going through the court and really making a good faith effort, it sounds like, to comply, but maybe it was a moving target.
It was a moving target. The goalposts in environmental court are always changing at the whims of whoever happens to be sitting on the bench that day, or whatever target the individuals you're dealing with, which there's, again, no real clear record of, happen to decide. And this was a decades worth of really abuse that Ms. Holmberg suffered as a result, and ended up, as astonishing as it sounds, becoming a fugitive from justice. I mean, when a woman who has lost the roof over her head and is in ill health suddenly finds herself with a warrant for her arrest and has to essentially flee, it's just nightmarish.
And she had to declare bankruptcy as well, right? From the costs of all of this protracted just ordeal.
Absolutely. She ended up in a bankruptcy proceeding where essentially all of her possessions and all of really her legal interests as a human being were suddenly now on the line because of this process of being stuck in environmental court. And needless to say, I mean, the psychological, the physical effects that this can have on somebody's health going through this, where they're essentially fighting for their life, but without a real record being made so that they can ultimately vindicate their rights on appeal. This was just something where we knew we had to step in.
It sounds like her life was indeed ruined. That was an exaggeration at all. And it really makes somebody wonder, how could this even happen? How does a court like this come to be, where people are just so at the whims of the momentary person who happens to be running things? And Keith, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about where this court actually came from.
Absolutely, Melanie, and that's a great question. You know, the environmental court has a long history in Memphis. We can actually trace it back to 1983, when the environmental court was first created as a division of Memphis's city courts. And for a long time, it was sort of a benign institution. It focused mostly on dealing with property code issues, and people's homes weren't being taken, and the power it had was actually quite limited. But in 1991, the Tennessee legislature, in conjunction with Shelby County, decided to turn that city court into a general sessions court, and with it, give it the power to hold people in contempt for refusing to obey orders. And from there, the system began to snowball. As Rob alluded to, it doesn't have these rules of evidence. It doesn't have the kind of safeguards that you would expect to see in a court. And this issue multiplied when, in 2004, the Tennessee legislature passed this act called the Neighborhood Preservation Act, which is a piece of legislation that permitted private entities and private individuals to sue homeowners in the state, homeowners of vacant lots, to have those lots declared a public nuisance. And the court could then further order those folks to repair the lot, and if they couldn't, the court had the power to appoint a receiver, which would then take control of the property, make repairs, and could then sell the property in order to recoup their costs. But what made it particularly troublesome is, in 2016, the Tennessee legislature expanded the act. In 2004, it was limited to vacant houses, but in 2016, they expanded it, and they said that suits under the Tennessee Neighborhood Preservation Act could be brought against homeowners who were living in their homes, like Sarah Hohenberg. And so you had this court that didn't have the proper safeguards, now adjudicating claims that could result in a person losing their home. So it didn't happen overnight. It happened over decades and decades of a slow accumulation of power. And it's left people like Sarah Hohenberg homeless and, as Rob explained, a fugitive from justice.
So, I mean, couldn't an argument be made that the purpose of this court was actually maybe a legitimate public purpose? If you have abandoned buildings or properties that are becoming some kind of threat to neighbors, or that leave them kind of feeling vulnerable or exposed, that the government needs some means by which to deal with those properties. How would you respond to that concern, which is probably a legitimate concern for a lot of people in Memphis?
Well, fighting blight is certainly something that governments have the right and authority to do. And blight is a problem in urban centers like Memphis, and they should be able to combat it. But what we're saying is that they need to combat it the right way. They need to combat it within the limits of the Constitution. And there's a big difference, constitutionally speaking, between vacant, abandoned, derelict properties and a person's home. And when a person's home is involved, when Sarah Hohenberg's home is at stake, she deserves some very serious due process protections, because no one should lose their home in a proceeding that they can't effectively appeal, where they aren't guaranteed to have witnesses who are sworn in, where evidence isn't authenticated and a record isn't kept. A home is a person's most important belonging. You see cases referring to a person's home as their castle. And a person shouldn't be able to lose their home in that circumstance unless they go before a very legitimate court that follows legitimate constitutional processes. So if Memphis wants to fight blight, they can, but they just need to follow the Constitution when they do it.
So, Rob, could you talk a little bit about how widespread these kinds of courts are? Is this kind of a creature that was created in Memphis and got a little bit out of control, and once we fix it in Memphis, it's not a problem anymore? Or are we seeing these kinds of things happening elsewhere?
We are seeing them elsewhere. And in fact, the model that Memphis set up for its environmental court has for decades been promoted by the court's founders around the country as a model for other municipalities to adopt. We know at this point that there's at least 70 such courts around the country, and we've identified some other examples that are the sort of systemic, mechanistic types of housing courts that Memphis has. In the city of Detroit and Cleveland, both of which, by the way, as Keith mentioned, have real blight problems, are using this kind of expedited process through their housing courts to have proceedings where people could indeed risk losing their homes. So this is a real problem, and that's why the impact of this case could be so profound. It's no coincidence that Detroit and Cleveland are both within the Sixth Circuit, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, where this case has been brought. So a victory here in the long run could really bring justice and due process to citizens in a number of states who find themselves caught in this kind of court.
Have you heard stories of citizens in these other places that are similar to Sarah's, or is hers still pretty much the most outrageous that we've run across?
Well, we don't have to go outside of Memphis to hear another outrageous story. Our other client in this case had an extreme story. And Ms. Holmberg had an arrest warrant issued. This gentleman named Joseph Hansen was actually thrown in jail with environmental court orders for more than a total of 20 days. And just letting that sink in for a second, it just defies all of our common expectation of the exercise of care that should happen in a courtroom, that somebody could be thrown in jail and completely lose their liberty in a court that doesn't have basic functions of keeping a proper adversarial hearing recorded, having a transcript where you can go back and check it, and to find yourself sitting there helplessly in jail as a result is just, it's almost inconceivable. So these two stories together are really going to shed light on what can happen when the sort of secrecy of a courtroom gets out of control and abuse begins.
And it just sounds like it snowballs, because what was the initial problem in the other client's with his home or with his property? Was it another tree, or, I mean, a relatively minor kind of infraction?
Well, once again, it was a tree falling. And essentially what we have now are two instances where Memphis exploited the victims of natural disasters, robbing them of their homes. Mr. Hansen's home, as crazy as it sounds, was actually bulldozed by the city while he was out of town. And
that's outrageous.
It really, I mean, to come back and all of your possessions, all your computers, everything is just flattened. And to think that you have no real recourse to be able to right that wrong until now, real recourse. It just, this really was, we hear a lot about a lot of sort of really questionable practices and deprivations of process at IJ, but this has to be one of the most extreme.
So, Keith, could you talk a little bit, as the lawyers, now we have to, what exactly is IJ challenging here? What are the legal claims? Is it really just focused on the court procedures, or what's going on in the case itself?
So I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's focusing on the procedures. The Constitution says that a person can't be deprived of their life, their liberty, or their property without receiving due process of law. And the procedures that a person is entitled to vary depending on how important that interest is. So a property interest like your home, being the most important piece of property that most people own, is entitled to a great deal of process before the government can take that away from you. And in the environmental court, you just don't have any of the basic courtroom procedures that you would expect. I kind of like to think of it as, everyone has seen an episode of Law and Order. Everyone's seen, lawyers arguing before a judge and witnesses get sworn in. They promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Evidence is authenticated before it's presented, and you have a courtroom stenographer who's taking fastidious notes. But the environmental court looks nothing like that. As Rob explained, it's a nightmarish DMV. And at the end of the day, you don't leave without your driver's license. You instead leave and can get thrown in prison, or you leave and you never see your home again. And it's those kinds of problems that we're going to try to challenge in this case. We're trying to get a ruling from a court that says, look, the environmental court, if it wants to take away people's homes, if it wants to have the power to adjudicate these issues, you have to have constitutional safeguards. You have to make sure that this is a proceeding that's being conducted effectively and within the confines of the U.S. Constitution.
So it's a due process case then? That's
right.
So Rob,
it's a due process challenge.
If we win this case, obviously you mentioned it could change the court in Memphis. It could change the courts elsewhere in the Sixth Circuit and in Cleveland or Detroit. What about our clients, the people who have suffered so egregiously here? What does a victory look like for them? I mean, how can the government make right this truly outrageous behavior?
Well, given what happened, I don't know that it could ever really be made right, but what there can be is an attempt to try to make them at least whole again. And this is somewhat unique in the realm of IJ cases because we are seeking damages on their behalf. The complaint alleges that they have to have some sort of recompense to be made whole to the point where they are no longer homeless fugitives from justice as a result of the constitutional deprivation. That just can't be.
Well, thank you both for taking on this case, which it sounds like has long been something that needed to be tackled. And thank you for taking the time to talk about it. Thanks to all our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to check out our YouTube channel and to subscribe. And you can find more episodes wherever you get your podcasts.